Hello guys, welcome to episode 3 of this series where we are talking about MobX. Now in this episode I'm going to talk a little bit about, observing a state and how to, react to the changes that happen in the state of the application and how to make your components reactive. So we're going to, learn how MobX observes the state inside of the components. So basically this means how components react to the changes that happen inside of the state that MobX maintains for your application. And this of course makes the components reactive, meaning that they react to these changes in the state of your application using the observer function. And then we're going to understand how reactivity helps us with updating the UI or user interface of the application, and how fine-grained reactivity helps us to be to react to the changes in a very optimal manner. Now let's talk about reactivity in MobX. So we now know that MobX tracks observable values. So the observable values are the values that you want your components to observe, your components to react to, right? So these are, these kind of make up the state of your application, these observable values. And then any component, when these observable values change, any component that is observing these values will automatically re-render to reflect those changes. And of course, the components only re-render whenever whenever some change happens to these observable values. Now, in order to make your components, your React components reactive, meaning that, in order to make them react to the changes in the state of your application, you need to wrap your components inside of a function called observer, which comes from MobX, React Lite, right? So then we're going to use the observable values inside the render function, and this will make your component reactive, meaning that whenever some change happens to the state of the application, the components that are observing those observables will re-render. So this makes the components reactive. This is more efficient than Redux because only the components that use a piece of a state will ultimately re-render, and you do not need to do any manual memoization or selectors. Let's talk about the component decomposition inside of our application. We are going to break up the UI into two different components. We're going to make them observers, so they're going to be reactive. We're going to have the project list component and the task list component. The most important thing here for the project list component is that it has been wrapped inside of this observer function, right? This observer function coming from MobX React Lite. And of course, we are importing our root store, as you can see here, right? We are creating an interface for the props of our component. We are receiving the props here. So we are receiving unselected project, which is going to be, like a handler. And then we're going to receive selected project ID. So these are the props that this component will receive from the parent component. And then as you can see, we are accessing the projects array inside of our root store. We are mapping each project object, and for each one we are rendering this li element. So for each li element, we are going to handle the onclick of that li using the event handler that we have received as a prop here. And we're going to pass the ID of the current project. As you can see here, we're going to render the name of the project here, right? And here there is this conditional style. So we're going to apply the font weight, right? If the project ID of the current project is equal to the selected project ID which we have received as a prop, the font weight is going to be bold. Otherwise, it's going to be normal. And then the cursor is going to be pointer. So again, the most important thing to remember here for your reactive components in MobX is to wrap the component inside of this observer function coming from the MobX React Lite. So this is the first project the first component that we're going to develop, project list. So let me take you to my application, and inside of this application, I'm going to create this project list component. project list .tsx. So if you take a look at app.tsx, this is the only component that we have right now. So we're kind of, decomposing this big component into, let's say this a smaller, more focused component. So I'm gonna, import observer. I'm gonna import the root state, the root store, and then I'm gonna wrap my component. This is the props, by the way. I'm gonna receive an event handler and a selected project ID. And then I'm gonna wrap my component inside of an observer function, receiving my props. And then I'm gonna map over the projects array coming from my root store. And for each one, I'm gonna render an li element. I'm gonna set this piece of style conditionally. And then I am going to handle the click event of each li element using that prop that I have received. So this is the first component that we have, created. So let's continue with the notes and talk about the next component we're gonna develop. The next component is gonna be task list. So again, task list is gonna be wrapped inside of this observer function. It's gonna receive this only, piece of prop. So we're gonna receive an object of type project. And then we are going to, import the project type from our models. We're gonna, import observers. And then if you take a look here, we are going to render the name of the project, which we have received from the props. And then we are going to map over the project, as you can see here, map over the tasks associated with that project. And for each task, we're gonna render an li element. And inside of that li, we're gonna have a label, we're gonna have an input. And for that input, the type of the input is checked, right? And whether the task is completed or not, we're gonna, set the checked like this. And then the unchanged will call the toggle function of a task that is, the current task of this map function, right? So this is another component called task list. Let's create that as well. So let me go ahead and create the task list component. So task list.tsx. This is going to be the next component that we're going to develop. So importing observer, importing project from other models, and then creating the props. Now the component itself, task list, wrapped inside of the observer function. And then we're going to map over the tasks of the project, which we have received from the prop. For each task, we're going to render an li element with label, with input, and so on. So this kind of completes the next component that we need. Now let's continue with the notes, and then we will, connect all of these components at the end of this episode. Now let's go through the explanation again. So observer makes your components reactive. MobX will automatically re-render these components only when the values they are observing, change. In project list, it ensures the component re-renders only when the projects or selected project ID change. Very efficient. Tasks update instantly when toggled due to MobX efficient reactivity system. Now, let's talk about observer in more detail. The observer is the function that the component needs to be wrapped inside. So observer is a higher order function, HOC, right? Or a function wrapper from MobX React Lite. So an HOC or higher order function is a function that does either two things. First, receives another function as input or returns another function as output. So we use this observer, which is an HOC or higher order function, to wrap our components, the components that we want to be reactive. So what it does is that it makes your React component reactive to the observables inside of your MobX store. So when any observer data used inside of the component changes, the component will automatically re-render to reflect the latest state. Now, without observers, your component won't update when the values inside of those observables change. Why is this important again? So it lets you write clean reactive components in React that automatically stay in sync with the changes happening to your state. And this improves performance significantly by re-rendering the components only when the values inside of those observables change. Simple analogy, think of observer like a smart watcher. So it watches which observables change. The observables are the values inside of your state. So whenever those values change, your component is going to react to them. And it's going to update. It's going to re-render to reflect those changes, to stay in sync with the values inside of your state. It kind of refreshes your component. Pro tips. Don't wrap the entire app in a single observer. It is better to have multiple focused, smaller observers for fine-grained updates and reactivity. MobX, again, doesn't care where the state comes from, only that the used observables are tracked inside the render function. So if you take a look at our application so far, so if I take you, for example, to these different files inside of the stores, you can find this root store, right? So we have already talked about these, how to, for example, create observables, the values that you want to be observed by your reactive components. We talked about this counter store as a simple example. Right now we're working with root store, right? And this root store includes some observables, like for example this array. So this array is an observable. It means that whenever there is this component that observes this observable, when the value inside of this array changes, that component is going to react by re-rendering because it wants to stay in sync with the values inside of your observables. The last step for us is to update the app component. So inside of the app component, we're going to import the two components we just developed. We're going to import observer. We're going to import root store, the root store of the application, and use state. And here, as you can see, we are creating different states because we want to maintain some data inside of our app component. We want project name, we want task title, we want selected project ID. And if you take a look here, we are going to construct this selected project using the projects array of the root store. So basically, we are going to go to the projects array inside of our root store, and we are going to find the project whose ID matches the selected project ID we maintain inside of this state. Or we're gonna, if we do not have anything inside of selected project ID, this selected project is gonna be null, right? And then here, there are different, for example, inputs. So we've got this input that is bound to the, project name. So two-way data binding with unchanged and value. We've got this button that is responsible for adding a new project. So it's going to, do some trimming on the name of the project, and then it's going to call the add project method from the root store, and then pass the project name. And then it's going to reset the, state. Then we've got this project list component that we created. We're going to pass the selected project ID. This comes from our state, and we're going to pass this set selected project ID based on the the local state that we maintain here. And then we've got this this selected project. So if this has some value, we're going to render this portion of our component, which is responsible for allowing the user the ability, for giving the user the ability to add a task So basically we've got an input, right? We have bound the input to the task title state inside of this component, and whenever the button is clicked, we're going to use the add task to project method from our root store to add this task to the project whose ID we can get using the selected project.id. And then we have the task list component, right? And we're going to set the project prop using the selected project, which we have constructed here. Now let me go ahead and write the code for the app component. So I'm going to go to my app component. I'm going to remove this code. Then I'm going to write the new version of this component. Let me import observer. Let me import use state. And then we're going to import the root store as well as the two components we just developed. Project list and task list. Now the component itself is going to be wrapped inside of an observer. Let's create some local states, project name, task title, as well as the selected project ID. Now let's construct selected project using the projects array inside of our root store. Then let's return the template. So basically what we are going to do is to give the user the chance to create a new project using this input, which is bound to the project name. And then we are going to use the add project function from our store. The next step is to render the project list and setting the two props on select project and selected project ID. Now let's render the tasks associated with a selected project. So this is the input that allows the user to create a new task. And we are going to assign this new task to the selected project. Lastly, we are going to use the other component that we just created, task list, and we're going to pass a project so that the tasks associated with that project are rendered. And let me export the component itself. So this is it. I'm going to remove these two, and our application is ready. So if you take a look, we have the ability to create a new project. For example, I'm going to say React course. I'm going to add this project, and this is the project that I have. If I click that, I have this input to create some tasks. For example, I can say prepare the, let's say, notes, record the videos, publish the videos. So tasks for this project, right? If I take you to the task list component, right? Take a look here. This is the H3 rendered by this, task list component, tasks for project name. And I can go ahead and, check some of these tasks. It means that these, tasks are complete now. Let me go ahead and create another project. I'm going to call this Angular course. I'm going to click that, and this is, the font weight which we applied here, right? So whenever a kind of project is clicked, is selected, the font weight is going to, be applied. And then I can say prepare the notes as the first task, publish the notes as the second task. And then I can, for example, click this new, let's say, task to say that this is done. And yeah, this is how it works. Now, let me go through the summary Now, in this episode, we decomposed the UI into reactive, fine-grained, smaller components. We learned how MobX tracks observables and triggers component updates. We kind of, used the observers or the components inside the observer function. Observer is an HOC, higher order function. So these functions, you wrap these functions around your components, and that makes your components reactive. So they're going to react to changes inside of your observables. And now we have a dynamic UI that reacts instantly to the changes happening in your store. And I'm going to wrap up this video here, and I'm going to continue this course, this discussion in the next one.